So good morning and welcome. My name is Ross Sandler. I am Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for New York City Law. And I welcome you on behalf of New York Law School and Dean Anthony Crowell to the 168th CityLaw Breakfast. We are pleased to welcome so many old friends to the breakfast and many new friends. And thank you for attending and for making CityLaw Breakfast an important public forum. I wish to thank the generous and loyal founding sponsors of the CityLaw Breakfast who've been with us so many years. First, Consolidated Edison, Verizon, and the law firm of Greenberg Traurig. We thank them for their loyal support. I also want to thank the many Gold Star individual contributors who voluntarily contributed to support the breakfast when they signed up to attend. We are enormously grateful for your support. Today's speaker is Steve Banks, Commissioner of the City Department of Social Services, and he will speak on COVID-19 and its impact on social services and homelessness. Commissioner Banks will take questions and comments following his prepared talk, just as we would do if we were back at the law school. To submit a question or comment, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. You may submit a question or comment at any time during the presentation, and we encourage you to do so. Please identify yourself with your first and last name and your organization. Again, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to submit a question or a comment. Mayor Bill de Blasio appointed Steve Banks as Commissioner of the Department of Social Services in 2014. Today, as Commissioner, he is in charge of the city's vast social services programs and its homelessness programs. Prior to becoming commissioner, Banks enjoyed a distinguished career for 33 years as a litigating attorney at the Legal Aid Society, rising to head the Legal Aid Society as its attorney-in-chief. At Legal Aid, Banks was counsel for the advocacy group Coalition for the Homeless. Banks was the lead attorney representing homeless persons in their litigation against the city. And as attorney representing the Coalition for the Homeless, Banks helped write the terms of the consent order setting out the city's responsibilities to homeless persons. And then, with his appointment in 2014 as commissioner, Banks took the place of the former commissioners. The result is that Commissioner Banks is now responsible for delivering the very promises lawyer Banks helped write into the old consent order, and this has not been an easy task. Today, the city's efforts on behalf of homeless persons is again under scrutiny, this time for how the city has responded to COVID-19. We are delighted that Commissioner Banks has agreed to discuss these difficult issues at a City Law Breakfast. Commissioner Banks, welcome to New York Law School's virtual podium. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ross. It's a pleasure to be here. You and I have known each other for many years in many different roles that you've had and many different roles that I've had, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I know that Dean Crowell is out there somewhere, and I appreciate our long relationship together and with New York Law School. You know, I was thinking, Ross, before I came on this morning about the last time I spoke at a City Law Breakfast series. It was freezing cold. It was early in 2017, late 2016, somewhere in that period of time. And at that point, I had been appointed the commissioner of HRA, and the mayor had asked me to conduct a 90-day review of homeless services that resulted in the merger, if you will, of HRA and the Department of Homeless Services under the structure of the Department of Social Services. And we talked that day about a lot of the challenges of almost 40 years of social services and homeless policy in New York City. But in many respects, that's like another world. In the last 6 months has clearly created many new challenges for our clients. And although the presentation this morning is entitled, Impact of COVID on social services, I really want to focus on the impact of COVID on our clients, largely people of color who are being affected by the virus and also the economic impact of the virus. And I also want to mention that our staff has continued to provide services, as I am in our offices, for this entire 6-month period of time. I'll describe how we've done that, but we have frontline, literally frontline first responders in the social services field that have been delivering services that our clients desperately need right now. And as well as I want to give a shout out to our not-for-profit partners in the social services and legal services community who have played such a key role in delivering services to clients during this very difficult period of time. So just to start with the key missions of HRA and the Department of Homeless Services. I mean, the Department of Social Services, HRA, was set up by Lindsay originally as one of the so-called super agencies to provide a full range of services to clients. And the mission of HRA is fundamentally to fight poverty. And the mission of DHS, which was broken out of HRA in the 1990s, and then we merged it as part of the 90-day review. The mission of DHS is to address homelessness. And one of the key findings of the 90-day review is that the city had a very haphazard approach to homeless policy over a 40-year period of time, dating back to the various consent decrees and orders affecting first single adults and then families and families with children in particular. And so when I became commissioner of HRA and then DHS, but starting with HRA, we really saw our mission as reforming the foundations of how to provide services and access to benefits for New Yorkers seeking help from HRA. And people will remember that among the things we found was the challenges of people losing their benefits and requesting fair hearings, and then only to have a fair hearing officer find at the state level that the person should have their case reopened. And so we set about a whole range of reforms, principally to make access to benefits like you and I would have access to our banking. So we got federal and state waivers to provide food stamps online, applications online, interviews on demand by telephone. And we implemented a series of reforms that would enable people to essentially skip the trip to the center and be able to interact with us without having to come in and wait in an office, and really improve the client experience that had been centered around coming into an office for decades. And we were moving towards trying to convert the cash assistance program in the same way that we had the food stamp SNAP program to enable clients to apply online and to submit applications online and interviews by telephone to avoid having to come and wait in an office, just like all of us don't go and wait in a bank anymore, and dramatically improve the experience of our clients. In the process, we made a number of reforms, eliminating the WEP program that was not leading to employment. We revamped our approach to employment. And most particularly, we worked with Legal Aid and others to make a significant change in the state law to eliminate durational sanctions for public assistance recipients in the event that they were had been allegedly non-compliant with something. We wanted to eliminate the durational sanction relating to employment. And as a result of all these reforms, we cut down the number of fair hearing requests by about half. Which essentially means we're cutting in half the numbers of people that had grievances about how they were getting services from us. I give you all of that as background because that was the foundation that confronted us at the beginning of March, where there was an immediate need to make sure that our staff and our clients could be safe at home and not have to come into an HRA office to get public benefits. And so we had the system already in place for food stamps so that clients would not have to come into an office, and that they could apply online, and that they could have interviews by telephone. But we didn't yet have state waivers to set up a similar program. We asked for those waivers over a number of months, and then with great urgency before the shutdown order came, but we knew that it was important to have our clients at home and our staff at home. And so we got a waiver finally, and within 4 days stood up a system for cash assistance recipients that was parallel to the food stamp program, in which people could apply online, get interviews by telephone. But we knew that wasn't enough, and we requested a whole range of other federal and state waivers to make it possible for people to get our services from home without coming into the to one of our offices for food stamps and cash assistance. And similarly, we got waivers with respect to Medicaid and the ability to do substance use, domestic violence screenings. We got federal waivers that allowed us to waive interviews in certain categories of cases, that allowed us to push out requirements to recertify into the future. And all of that was made possible by literally overnight building a new system to deliver benefits by workers being able to deliver them from their homes. And we had to build new technology platforms. We created literally a laptop assembly line to create laptops for staff to be able to provide these benefits and assessments of clients from their homes. And in that period of time, we managed an increase in cash assistance that the IBO reported was the largest increase since 1967, and an increase in SNAP and food stamps that was the largest increase in the history of the program over the months. And we're continuing to provide those critical services to clients through that transformed approach. Similarly, working with other elected officials and the legal services community groups, the Right to Counsel Coalition, we advocated for a moratorium on evictions. And as the court has come into a position of moving forward with cases, we set up a process for our legal services providers to be able to provide counsel under a Right to Counsel law and programs to keep people from losing their homes in the midst of all of this. And we also have the ability to provide rent arrears payments to enable people to be able to remain in their homes. So again, when it comes to HRA, we created a foundation prior to COVID that we were able to turn around to be available to keep people from having to come into their offices to get assistance. In terms of homelessness, one of the key changes that we put in place that I spoke about earlier was this merger of HRA and DHS. And going back to the 1990s when DHS was broken out of HRA, it created a system for several decades in which HRA had all the homelessness prevention tools, and DHS did not have those tools, but DHS, on the other hand, had the obligation of providing shelter night to night. And so going back to the reform plans in 2016 and 2017, we thought it was important to combine the agencies to be able to have a more effective way to prevent homelessness and to provide services to people who are homeless. And there were really four key pillars of the approach to addressing homelessness. And again, each of those approaches has stood us in good stead to deal with this unprecedented circumstance that our clients and our agency and our workers confront. First, we took a prevention first approach. And as part of that, with working with the City Council, the Right to Counsel Coalition, the legal services providers, we first piloted and then now have, as a matter of local law, a Right to Counsel law that is being implemented in order to provide counsel to people who are facing eviction. And we also dramatically increased our provision of rent arrears payments to people. Again, this is all pre-COVID. And so as a result, while evictions were up all across the country pre-COVID, in New York City between 2013 and the pre-COVID period, evictions were down 41%. And that was a significant reform and a significant change that really required a broad-based partnership with the courts, with legal services providers, the Right to Counsel Coalition, the council. Similarly, a second core component of our reforms was the importance of focusing on permanent housing. And so the city rebuilt rental assistance, which had been eliminated in New York City in 2011, resulting in a nearly 40% increase in family homelessness between 2011 and 2014. And so we rebuilt rental assistance, we opened up other permanent housing programs, and as a result, 150,000 people have been largely connected to permanent housing, moved out of shelter, or been able to remain in their homes in the first instance. Third component was addressing street homelessness, and We implemented ultimately a tripling of the number of outreach workers, a tripling of the number of safe haven and rent and special stabilization beds to help people come in from the streets. During COVID, we've added hundreds of additional beds. And all of that has enabled us to bring nearly 2,900 human beings off the street who most importantly have remained off the street. And that's really the gold standard metrics that we focus on. Every night is a victory, but we're looking to make sure that we are able to bring people off the streets who remain off the streets. And the last pillar was transforming a very haphazard system that, as I said, built up over 40 years, really trying to manage to the court orders as opposed to having a vision and underlying organizing principle of how to provide shelter. And so we said shelter should be sited so as to enable people to be housed as close as possible to the anchors of their lives, like schools for children, jobs, healthcare, houses of worship, support networks. And in order to do that, we needed to end the use of the cluster program, started during the Giuliani administration, which at its high point had 3,600 units. We've now cut that by 2/3, and we're well on the way to ending it over the next year, and that we would end once and for all the use of commercial hotels that dates back to the 1960s. And pre-COVID, we had been driving down the number of commercial hotels that the city was using. At the same time, we had announced that we would site 90 new community-based shelters, again, close as possible to the anchors of people's lives. To date, we've cited 71 of them, 39 of them are already up and operating. Before we talk about COVID response in terms of the area of homelessness, I also want to highlight some of the results that we now see. We see a shelter system that had a trajectory to end up with about 71,000 people in the shelter system before we started these reforms, and at its high point had gotten to 61,000 people. Today, it's about 55,000 people, and that's really, I think, a tribute to the terrific work of those that are providing legal services, those that are providing social services in the communities, all the prevention activities, and all the work of our providers and our staff to help move people out of shelter. Having said that, the census is really kind of a tale of two censuses. The families with children census is way down, and it reflects these prevention strategies. The numbers of families with children, the numbers of people in families with children is about 2012 levels, but the numbers of single adults continues to grow, and that reflects a number of other policy changes that are occurring, decarceration being one of them, a very important public policy, but to the extent that rents are out of reach of the people that are coming back into the community, shelter becomes the ultimate safety net. And so what we do see is while the families with children census is dropping significantly, we see the single adult census continuing to increase. So that brings us up in a parallel discussion as we discussed with HRA. What were the reforms? Did they stand us in good stead? And what did we do in response to COVID? When COVID hit, our first task was to make sure we had space that we could move people out of shelter if they showed symptoms or if they tested positive. And we had to stand up literally overnight at the beginning of March, middle of March, a isolation system to be able to identify, and a system to be able to identify symptoms, to quickly connect people to medical care if they needed it. And we developed a system to do that with Health and Hospitals and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. That required us, though, to create a system of isolation beds. Ultimately, we were able to stand up 700 beds. We didn't need to use them all, but we had them at the ready in case we needed to. We had the next phase that we had to implement was, in addition to isolation, what could we do to stop the spread of the disease to begin with, the spread of the virus? And to do that, we began to implement a de-densification initiative to reduce the density in the congregate shelters, whereas families with children could isolate in their rooms, or adult families could isolate in their rooms because those are private rooms. In the congregate shelters, we needed to set up a system to move people out. There was a lot of advocacy, a lot of discussion with very committed, terrific advocacy groups and the council about how to do it. And ultimately, over an 8 to 10 week period, we moved out thousands of people back into commercial hotel rooms. Although our policy is to get ourselves out of commercial hotels, and we had made progress in doing that pre-COVID, we realized that in order to address the magnitude of the pandemic, that we needed to return to hotels. And in a very short period of time, we stood up more than 60 hotels to move nearly 10,000 people out of our shelters. We already had about 3,500 people who were in commercial hotels who were employed in a special program we were using. So we had learned a lot by running that commercial hotel program pre-COVID for people who are employed. And that stood us in good stead to use as a model to begin to move people rapidly out of the congregate shelters into commercial hotels. Obviously, as the mayor said, and I have said, we want to reach a point where we can resume our efforts to get out of commercial hotels, but the initiative certainly stopped the spread of the virus. So a combination of the isolation and the systems that we set up to identify symptoms, and then with the move outs, first prioritizing senior citizens and others that have particular vulnerabilities, and then very much focusing on reducing the density in our congregate shelters. There are some clients that could be more effectively served in congregate shelters. Those clients remained so they could get those services, but in a much less, many fewer people in the shelters that we remained in. We then have moved to a system now with the testing and tracing initiative to do testing in all of our congregate, all of our single adult and adult family facilities, both the facilities that continue to operate for adult families and those who are still in congregate shelters, and those who are in the reduced density commercial hotel rooms. And we're working with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene on what would the metrics be and when and how we can phase out this program and when it will be safe to do so. So Ross, I've covered a lot of territory in about 20 minutes, but I don't want to leave without one last point to make, which is the following. In the world we're living in, there is a real need for federal leadership, and federal stimulus is really critical to the state and to the city to be able to meet the extraordinary needs and address the extraordinary impact on our economy. You can see it in the increases that I described in people receiving food stamps, people receiving cash assistance, and you can see it in the impact that I described in terms of the numbers of single adults needing our help. So there's a real need for federal support. There's also a need for borrowing authority to be able to address the very significant budget challenges that we have. And you know, I'm reminded of something that somebody said to me at a community meeting around a shelter siting. A person said, you know, you and de Blasio should do what LaGuardia did, which is LaGuardia built public housing in order to address the housing needs of low-income people in the midst of an economic dislocation. And the answer is very simple. LaGuardia had Roosevelt, and we don't have Roosevelt right now. But we have to do everything we can do, both in the city with the resources we've got, and we have to do everything we can do to seek the kind of federal resources and state borrowing authority that we need. So here we are, Ross, back to where we started.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Banks. That's a lot of data, a lot of information. I know we got some questions that have come up. The questions and comments have been collected by Brian Kasuba, who is the Associate Director of the Center for New York City Law. And we thank Brian and the staff of the center and the staff of the law school for their terrific work in putting together these breakfasts. Now, Brian has been collecting questions, and so he'll be the one who will ask the question. So Brian, what's the first question, a comment?
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Commissioner, for your words. So we have several questions, and if anyone wants to continue asking them, please do, and we will get to as many as we can in the time we have allotted. The first, again, please announce your name and also your affiliation. The first question is from Jeff Center. He is from the Legal Aid Society, and he's asked, what do we know about how New York State is shaping the extra $300 in unemployment from the Trump's order?
Excellent question, Jeff. Some of you know this. I do a weekly call for electeds, for community-based organizations, for providers, for advocacy groups. And we do that as part of trying to push out information. We send out a weekly communication. And we were discussing this just yesterday afternoon. We know right now that initial state plans seem to cover several weeks in August for those benefits. We don't have full information yet about how that $300 will be pushed out. It's critically important, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the original $600 payment really was a critical lifeline to so many New Yorkers who otherwise would have been seeking cash assistance or food stamps. And so getting that $600 federal stimulus, federal unemployment benefits paid again through another stimulus is still essential. I appreciate that the governor is taking advantage of the imperfect Trump $300, and I know the state's working on details, but please stay tuned to information we will continue to push out in our weekly community calls and in our weekly community communications. But that's all the information we have right now.
Great. Our next question comes from Rochelle Stearns from the Open Hearts Initiative. How can you possibly support the decision to move men out of Upper West Side hotels where they had been moved to save their lives from COVID-19?
So let me leave all of the public discussions about this to where they've been. The mayor spoke about this yesterday. I want to be very clear. The individuals in that facility are not being moved back into congregate shelters. As both the mayor and I have said, we are in fact developing a plan with the health department about when and how it would be safe to resume use of congregate shelters. We want to get back to our original plan of getting out of commercial hotels, but we are going to follow the health and the science on this. The moves of the individuals, and there's also a move of individuals in another facility, another commercial hotel facility in Queens near the Queensbridge houses, largest public housing development in the United States. And we're moving the individuals in both commercial hotels into other space where they can continue to isolate, not into congregate shelters.
Okay, our next question comes from Jonathan Bing from Greenberg Traurig. There have been an increase in cash assistance applicants since the pandemic. And he's aware that there have been an increase in substance abuse since the pandemic. What is DSS doing to identify these individuals with substance use disorders and subsequently referring them to the appropriate treatment program?
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for the question. Always a pleasure to hear from you. I appreciate the work that you do as well. And I should have said that to Jeff at the Legal Aid Society as well. So there's a couple of elements to your question. Jonathan, let me try to unpack it first. You're correct to focus on the increased numbers of cash assistance applications that we have received. And the caseload has increased. Again, the IBO reported to like 1967 increased levels. We managed that increase by reassigning about 1,300 of our staff who were performing critical functions but not frontline functions. And using the system that we built, we have the ability to screen for substance use challenges by telephone and connect clients to substance use programs. And we also have the ability, and we have been doing follow-up with those clients in terms of their needs and making sure that we can continue connect them to substance use programs. There is a federal and state requirement that we do so. And we, in seeking our waivers, were able to demonstrate to the state that we could do so remotely without requiring clients who need substance use services to come into one of our offices.
Great. This question is coming from Tawaki Kamatu. To what extent is HRA and DHS legally responsible for how Urban Pathways operates in providing shelters through contracts with HRA and DHS? And where are the details written about this?
So Urban Pathways is a long-standing provider of social services in New York City. Among other things, they provide supportive housing. They also took part in an initiative that we put in place in 2015 that resulted in HUD certifying the city for having ended chronic veterans homelessness. And so Urban Pathways was one of the partners with New York City to provide housing resources for veterans who moved out of our shelter system. And those veterans have leases or rental agreements with Urban Pathways. And there is certainly a process through our ombudsman's office if any resident of one of those facilities has a complaint.
Great. This next question is from Courtney Gross from New York One. Does this set a precedent to move people out of neighborhoods where residents complain, where the Upper West Siders complaint's valid, and she understands you're going to listen to health department, but has the hotel association contract been extended past October? Will people be moved back before a vaccine?
So again, a lot of questions, Courtney. Always appreciate your questions. You and I go back a long time to a number of the roles that Ross highlighted that I've had over time. Let me try to answer your question as best I can. I think you know this because you've covered it, that we have cited now 71 shelters and gotten 39 of them already up and operating. We're clearly on our way to getting more shelters up and operating and citing more shelters up to the full 90. And in many communities, there have been disputes. In a few communities, there have been lawsuits. We have persevered. We've opened those shelters. We've had lawsuits in Maspeth, in Glendale, in College Point, in Ozone Park, in Crown Heights, in the Upper West Side. It's a relatively small number, but we prevail in those lawsuits from communities all around the city. The use of hotels was always a temporary measure to address COVID. And we've made adjustments as we've gone along in terms of where those hotels have been located. We're going to be guided by the science, as I've said a number of times publicly, and I've said in this setting as well. We have a contract with the Hotel Association that is continuing. And at the point in time when we have the appropriate guidance to do so, we'll continue, we'll phase out the use of hotels. But that doesn't mean while we're using hotels, as we've done all along, that we won't make adjustments in terms of where and how we're sheltering people. And we've been doing that since the beginning of the dedensification initiative. We've closed certain hotels, we've opened other hotels, we've taken made a number of modifications throughout the process. This is unprecedented. If you think of any time in the city's history, and I know there's been national coverage on this, that no city has done anything like this, moving almost 10,000 human beings out of congregate shelters in an 8 to 10 week period of time was an unprecedented, massive undertaking. It stopped the spread of the disease. But as we went along, we've made adjustments in terms of where those hotels are located and how we're serving the individuals. And we'll continue to do that until we're at the point where we can phase out the program.
All right, thank you. Next question is from James Parrott. With an extensive provision of unemployment benefits, what accounts for the increase in those on public assistance since March? with 1 million or more New Yorkers losing jobs and their health insurance, how great has been the increase in Medicaid rolls, and what are the numbers likely to look like on the 1-year anniversary of COVID?
Great question, James, and your work is so important, and I really appreciate it. I think what's reflected in clients coming to us for cash assistance and food stamps, I think reflects the numbers of people who have very precarious employment, who may have challenges with unemployment benefits, and therefore come to us. And I think that's why you saw those increases that the IBO reported on in terms of both cash and food stamps. Of course, once the $600 benefit ran out, we had more people coming to us seeking food stamps. I think that reflects how important that $600 has been to keeping people afloat and not having to rely upon our public benefits. I think your broader question really is one of what does a federal stimulus look like? What does borrowing assistance look like for New York City? Because the New York State and the New York City budgets and economies have been very hard hit, and we're not the only state and only city that have experienced that across the country. So I think a lot of how 1 year will look from now will depend on what the federal policies are that enable states like New York and cities like New York to address this unprecedented challenge.
Thank you. The next question is from Elizabeth Cosienda. What steps are being taken to ensure that shelter residents have access to free, reliable internet and Wi-Fi access in shelters so they can access all of the vital resources that have been moved online in light of COVID?
Great question, and I know that there was a very good study that your organization did on this, and it's the reason why we partnered with the Department of Education when remote learning started last spring to provide cellularly enabled laptop iPads for families so that irrespective of Wi-Fi access, children could have access to remote learning. We worked with the DOE for this year to make sure that the children who are now coming of school age or might have had problems with their device are able to get continued access to a cellularly enabled Wi-Fi device. I understand the underlying issue is, install Wi-Fi everywhere. But to us, the most important thing is in the short run, what can we do to make sure that children and families have access to Wi-Fi for remote learning? And that's why we work with the Department of Education. I appreciate what they did, which is to get a cellularly enabled iPad, sorry for the technology confusion, cellularly enabled iPads to our families, which enabled them to participate in the DOE programs. I understand the long-term issue about Wi-Fi, but we got to focus on what we can do right now, and that's how we have tried to address that. I think another important thing to remember for the families and individuals who get our services, that one just statistic, which I think is important to understand, 76% of the applications we were getting for food stamps, for example, in February pre-COVID were submitted electronically, and 98% of applications were submitted electronically in June. So our clients do have smartphones. We did set up a process for clients who have challenges using technology. We got a federal waiver and a state waiver to enable our own workers to take applications by phone if needed as a reasonable accommodation. But that's just another dimension of access to technology. But to the heart of your question, the partnership with the DOE is what's in the short term really going to enable the children who are in our shelters to have access to remote learning as they did during the springtime period.
Thank you. Next question is from Richard Jordan, Dean of United Nations Non-Governmental Organizations. How will you ensure homeless are registered and can vote?
That is an important question. Let me take a slight digression for a moment. One of the most important things anybody can do who's listening to this is to ask 10 people, have they completed the census? Make sure that anyone in your circle of friends, family, acquaintances have completed the census. New York City needs that in order to have proper representation, in order to have proper funding. The census relates to the federal funding for housing, for healthcare, a whole range of services. It also relates to our representation. And you can go to nyc.gov for ability to click on and complete the census. In terms of voting, our clients have the right to vote, and we do make voter registration materials available through both HRA and the Department of Homeless Services, and we'll continue to do so.
Okay, next question is from Jeff Coots. You mentioned the impact of decarceration on the single adult census. Do we have good numbers on this trajectory of justice-involved clients in the shelter system as a percentage of the census, and our ability to stabilize their housing status and reduce the cycling between jails, EDs, and shelters?
Thank you, Jeff, for that question. Obviously, we're the safety net when all other safety nets fail. So we certainly have people who are on parole who are coming to us for help because they have no place else to go. We don't turn people away. Our doors are open. We provide shelter to them. And again, it's sort of like deinstitutionalization. That was an appropriate public policy, a really important public policy. It didn't result in the promise of community-based services. And so shelter systems and jails for many years became the de facto mental health systems, not just in New York City and New York State, but across the country. And now we have another major policy reform in terms of ending mass incarceration. But we have the challenge of what is awaiting people who are freed through the ending of mass incarceration. And for right now, for many, many people, what is awaiting them is our ability to provide them with shelter. We take that responsibility seriously. We will continue to do so. It's one of the reasons why our single adult census continues to grow, among other reasons. The number of apartments renting at $800, the vacancy rate's about 1.1%, which has been decreasing. That was pre-COVID. And for our single adult clients who have low wage employment, for example, or fixed incomes, it is a challenge to find housing that can be rented at that level. We're obviously pre-COVID, we're in a tremendous housing crisis, and that is continuing.
Okay, next question is from Andrew Almonte. Why, from the Law Department, why isn't New York State using its taxing authority to raise money for services? Why is federal assistance needed?
Let me give a shout out to the Law Department, being my lawyers, who used to be my adversaries for many years, as Ross pointed out, but I appreciate you having me as your lawyers, taking me as my lawyer. Look, I think there are a lot of policy questions about what's the best policy decision in New York State, what's the best policy decision nationally. I think we've got a national problem here. The pandemic and the economic impact of it is a national problem requiring a national public policy changes. That's why a federal stimulus is so important. The city's been on record about the importance of looking for other revenue sources in New York State. And that's been clear both in terms of taxation and most recently in terms of borrowing.
Okay, next question is from Glenn Newman from Greenberg Traurig. What is the plan for dealing with the renter areas that will exist once the moratorium on evictions ends? Renter arrears that exist once the moratorium on evictions ends?
I mean, like with so many areas, we are the safety net when all other systems fail. And so we have the ability to provide rent arrears. The systems that we stood up and put in place pre-COVID, again, as I said in my remarks, really stand us in good shape. We provided rent arrears to about 250,000 cases, 250,000 households or so over the last 6.5 years. That's a dramatic increase in the amount of rent arrears that had been previously provided. I think part of that is through the merger of DHS and HRA. If you're HRA and provide rent arrears in a vacuum, you make a decision, in one way. If you're HRA and provide rent arrears and you're merged with DHS, and if rent arrears aren't paid, the person could be evicted and go into shelter. I think it provides for a much better public policy approach, and that's how we got to the numbers of people that we helped with rent arrears payments. And we are prepared to do that as rent arrears are needed. We're getting applications right now from rent arrears, particularly from the two attorney conferences that the legal services community is handling on behalf of tenants that the court is conducting. We get rent arrears requests out of those already, and we take requests even without proceedings from landlords and tenants to pay arrears to avoid the need to bring assistance. So I think the short answer, Glenn, to your question is we have the foundation of a rent arrear system that we built before COVID. It will stand us in good stead during COVID. If we need to repurpose more, reassign more staff, we're prepared to do so. Right now, we have sufficient staff to cover people applying. And again, to make a plug for our systems, you can apply for rent arrears without coming into one of our offices. You can apply for rent arrears online.
Okay, next question is from Jerry Scup. What are the criteria being used to make location changes for temporary shelter locations?
So, I'll give you an example. The location by the Queensbridge House is a location where we had very quickly stood up a number of temporary COVID relocation sites. And we made a decision that we could better serve our clients by identifying space in our family system that could be used where individuals could continue to be in non-congregate settings. And that's how we're making decisions, in the sense that we've got space right now in our family system because the family census has come down significantly. That's why we now have about 55,000 people in shelter as opposed to the high point of 61,000. And the ability to use space in our family system is providing us with new options that we didn't have before in terms of phasing out certain hotels. So it's being driven by looking at where we have space and where we can make decisions about phase outs. But again, I want to apologize for interrupting you before you ask me another question. I want to again emphasize that this is not about returning to congregate shelter. That is a larger policy question that we will be able to move forward with when we've got the guidance from the Department of Health to do so.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Ellie Bilms. Thinking about the situation on the Upper West Side, do you believe that all neighborhoods in the city share an equal responsibility for housing our homeless residents?
Well, I think this is probably the last question, right? I think it's a good one to end on. I go back to what I said at the beginning, Ross, that we had 4 pillars of our reform program, Turning the Tide, and I talked about them when I last spoke at this breakfast. Prevention, that's why evictions have been driven down 41% pre-COVID. Rehousing, that's how 150,000 people have been connected to permanent housing. Bring people in off the streets, that's how nearly 2,900 people have come in off the streets. But of critical importance to the answer to your question, reforming a haphazard shelter system that built up over 40 years. And we said as part of the Turn the Tide, we were going to open shelters throughout the city to provide the ability of clients to be sheltered as close as possible to the anchors of their lives: schools, jobs, healthcare, houses of worship, communities. That's why we've opened shelters in communities that never had shelters before. When we are done siting all 90 shelters, and we've already got 71 of them sited, we will have access to shelter for our clients throughout the city in order to have a more equitable and a more effective shelter system than we've had in 40 years.
Thank you, Commissioner. The questions that we did not get to, we apologize for, but we have a record of them and we can share them with the Commissioner after the event. I'd like to now invite Ross Sandler back up.
Just briefly, thank you, Brian. Commissioner Banks, I wanted to ask one question. I can see that you're in your office. Could you tell us a little bit about how you're managing during this period with the agency? And then we're going to switch over to Dean and President Anthony Crowell, who will wrap up. But first, just how are you managing your agency during this period?
Thank you for the question, but I want to turn it around a little bit. It's how is our workforce managing the needs of our clients during this period of time? Because There's been a lot of talk about first responders. Social services staff are first responders. We stood up a system to be able to provide benefits from the home. So 84% of our staff now have the technology systems that we built literally overnight to do that. But that means we still have staff in our offices. We kept public assistance job center SNAP offices open, key centers in each borough. We have shelters still functioning. We have shelter intake offices still functioning. We have 24/7 staff out doing outreach and subway platforms still functioning. So we have real heroic city workers, along with not-for-profit workers, out every day delivering services. I could deliver services from my home, but I don't believe that you can lead an agency like this and ask workers to do what I have been asking them to do unless I lead from our office. And we have been in our offices, our central core staff, every day. We never shut down in order to make sure that we could provide the services for our clients. And I think that's part of leadership.
Thank you. And now I want to turn it over to Dean Anthony Crowell, the Dean and President of New York Law School.
Thanks so much, Ross. And thank you so much, Commissioner, for joining us this morning. It's an absolute pleasure to see you. And I very much appreciated your wonderful set of remarks and walking us through how the plans of the past few years have been able to help HRA and DHS and the city really sustain its social services system. You know, you talk a lot about planning, and I think about our conversations over the years, certainly your conversation in this forum a few years back, but also when you received your honorary degree at New York Law School in 2014. And you did undertake a massive planning effort. And I will say that you plan to make people's lives better, and you plan for the eventual crises. There are a few crises that could be as scaled as COVID has presented. And we're still really in the response phase. And I have to say that I hope everyone appreciates what has gone on at HRA. It's a clear record of enormous effort and many successes. But we are in the response phase right now for COVID. And we will be entering a phase of recovery, which could present itself a whole new host of issues, or really a magnified set of issues. So I just want to say that as a New York City resident, as someone who has shared public service with you, thank you for that work. But also I think for the Center for New York City Law and New York Law School, we will be very, very interested and certainly a significant resource to help everyone understand how we will step forward from response to recovery. I don't know if you want to, respond to that at all, but I just wanted to thank you for being here and sort of set the stage for a whole new set of work that will present itself to your agency.
Anthony, thanks so much. And, you and I go back a long way. Thank you for that honorary degree. I never got an honorary degree from any place. That was quite an experience. And I appreciate that you did that and gave me a chance to speak to law graduates. But I think you're absolutely right to focus. First of all, thank you for the praise for what we've done at the agency, notwithstanding all the challenges that we have had. And I fully acknowledge the challenges we have. And, I've said this many times, we've made major policy reforms, major policy changes, but that doesn't mean you couldn't walk into any one of our offices, any one of our facilities, any hour of the day, and still have a challenge as a client. And that's what keeps me up at night, how to minimize those challenges and make sure that our reforms are actual real things for real human beings. But I think you're absolutely right to separate this out between the response and the recovery. And we're moving from one phase to the other. And as we move from one phase to the other, the things we did in the response are going to be critical foundations to build upon as part of the recovery. Just in the way that the things we did before COVID, something we couldn't have ever anticipated. The things we did before COVID were a foundation about how to address COVID. Now what we've done during COVID will lead the way for the recovery.
Yeah, thank you so much. And let's hope that there is intergovernmental partnership and relief that is needed and warranted, to say the least. So again, we thank you so much for being with us and look forward to our continued partnership and to helping the public understand the important work of HRA and DHS. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This ends the breakfast. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Commissioner Banks. Thank you, Dean Crowell. And thank you, Brian Kasuba. We will see you on October 2nd when the next speaker will be Annette Gordon-Reed. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Okay.